First, make it exist, then make it better. Going from this to this happens at the end of a project. That last 20% that can make all the difference. Make it exist first, and then you spend your time making it better. The most common misconception I still see in 3D is that the process is linear, going from step to step to step until you're done. But that's not the case. The creative process is more like this. And if you're not careful, you can get stuck grinding on a single step for weeks or longer. Iteration and revisions aren't just part of the process, they are the process. Iteration is how things get better, period. And you can use that to make better art. In this video, I'll show you how you can spend more time iterating on your entire project and take your work to the next level in less time. This is the most important lesson for game artists. The creative process in general is what we're talking about today. How to best approach it and how to set yourself up for success, or maybe just how to set yourself up for the best results in the amount of time that you're gonna spend on a project. Take a look at this tweet. I thought this tweet from Mark really summed it up. The most important step, make it exist and then make it good later. He shows examples from one of his paintings. You see setting up and then finish. And that's what we're talking about today. Creativity thrives in the continual updating and refining and changing of everything. And this is common practice in all kinds of creative works. And you may have already heard some advice from other creative fields like writing is rewriting, or fail fast, or let's build a minimum viable product. But I still see 3D artists, especially newer ones, struggle with iterating holistically on an entire project, and they can get stuck at earlier stages before standing things up quickly. You want to set things up quick, loose, and not overcommit early on, so you can make big changes and improve kind of the big things, so that later when you're focusing on the small things, that can take a lot of time, but you can achieve that sort of polish. And what I want to stress is that it's not a linear step-by-step process, okay? You want to enable iteration the whole time, so you're not locking in. Now, we see this a lot in games, not just all the way down at the artist level for individual props, but holistically, when you're making a big project like a game that has hundreds or thousands of people working on it, you're gonna set things up. And also it relies on things being fun. It's just such a big collaboration between people that you need to set things up. So when making a game, the game designers, level designers will make blockouts. They'll make different levels, and they're gonna end up making a lot more levels than they end up shipping. And then when you're playtesting them, they're gonna be made of like white or gray boxes and not exactly look like final art, right? Because you need to find the fun, you need to balance things and change the size and relationships of things. Famously, in the Uncharted series, what the environment artists would do is they would make the environments out of gray, geometry, and edit it and change it so that they could design the gameplay and the experience. And then the art team later would dress things up and kind of work on top of that scaffolding and then make it look beautiful. But then they knew the camera, they knew where Drake would go, and they could really curate that experience the best they can. Back all the way down to the level of an individual artist, it's still important to work this way. There's this sense of, once we go to the next phase, oh no, I have to feel really confident, and we just don't. The creative process it's hard to feel confident ever, really. What we want to do is create a lot of time to work in context. So in 3D art, that means getting a model into the render scene that's going to be in the end, and have the elements of your project set up, like model, texture, lighting and everything. That way you can iterate and spend time on that whole thing. Teaching my class, a lot of students are new to this concept, and I just think this is how you can make better projects. That way you're not spending too much time on an early phase before finding out what's going to happen later, and you could kind of burn out. The quicker you can get to that end stage, even if it's kind of a mess, let's say, and you look at it and you're like, oh my God, I have so much work to do. At least you're in the final scene. You know what you're working on. You don't have to have such blind faith for so long. Since all the polish happens at the end of a project, if people burn out or get frustrated or flustered early on and bail on a project, they don't get to that last part. And that's where things really look better. That's where things come alive. That's where that polish happens, and we can be proud and play with cool effects and stuff. So I really want people to get to the end as soon as they can. and know that it's okay. You can go back at any stage of the process, all right? And practically this makes a lot of sense because when you're doing a high poly in ZBrush, you don't have the real lighting. You don't know what the actual forms are going to look like. And then when you're texturing and you're in Substance Painter, yes, it has a great real-time viewer, but the PBR values and math and lighting are not the same as the render scene in Unreal or Marmoset or Maya or wherever you're rendering. And you have material effects in Unreal that you're taking advantage of. You have the lighting and how it does that. You have the camera and how that looks. You want to be as close to that final product as possible so that you can iterate in context, or else you're gonna be wasting time trying to make something perfect here, seeing it through a different lens later in the project going, oh, whoops. A couple times at work, I've even brought in a decimated high poly model into Unreal to show people with lighting what the model would look like, just to get, high poly models approved, and just so we can see it in context. Like, here's the model in the engine. You don't have to use your imagination. What do you think about this? So the mindset shift really is, it's not that you're setting things up step by step, kind of brick by brick, and at the end standing back and taking a picture, and that's your render. That's not how it works. When I do projects, I have dozens or even hundreds of images that are coming out of those render cameras that don't end up being used. They're all work in progress images, just trying things out. What's this look like? What's this look like? It's not a one-way street. So I just want to share, that's how it's done. That's what we're doing. We're changing things all the time. You don't have to overcommit early. You want to go through the process so that you can iterate and spend most of your time trying to make that final product better, and not most of your time trying to make a perfect earlier stage like a high poly model. Next, I want to share with you a lesson from my character class just to show what updating everything looks like and how you can do that you can do that to free people up. Because I think a lot of the reason why people get stuck or they're slow to move on is they just don't have that kind of knowledge or experience updating and changing things, and it feels, a little bit more rigid than it is. So I think the more comfortable you are with making updates and changing things at different times in the process, at different software, then you can just feel a lot more free and confident that, hey, later I can make this look how I want.
Okay, this is what I think is the most important thing when it comes to creating the best work that you can. Iteration. Iteration is how literally all things get better. And when it comes to making your art, it's important to enable iteration as often as possible. So it's crucial that you understand how to update the various aspects of your character and that you're comfortable doing those updates. The common misconception for character art, or any art really, is that it's made one step at a time and that the process just kind of moves forward until the end, and that's when it's done. But that's definitely not the case at all. Changes, updates, iterations are happening throughout the process, and usually in a production environment, the more important a character is, the more iterations it goes through. So as artists, it's super common to not update or keep pushing on something to even slightly improve it because of that resistance we feel from not being comfortable, going through the update process, or maybe not even clearly understanding how to do a specific update. When I'm creating my digital characters, I rely on that constant updating process to finish. It's huge for me. These days, I'm not even concerned that much in the early stages of making a character. I just kind of sprint to getting the model and texture set up and into the final render scene, because I know that from that point on, I can update every element until I'm happy with everything overall. So in this lesson, I want to touch on the most common aspects of a character that can be updated and how to update them. So if you've been following along in the class up to this point, then you'll have your models and your textures and your render scene all started and in various stages of the process. Let's first take stock of what we have and where it all lives. We have our actual model, which lives in your DCC of choice. For me, that's Maya. Then we have our high poly models, and we actually have a decimated version and the full res version. Those both live in ZBrush. We have all of the textures for our character, which all live in Substance Painter, and that is our source files. Then we have the final render scene, or in our case, an Unreal Engine project, which has a level in it where our character is. Each of these things can and probably should be updated at some point during the process. So now let's take a look at each of the most common kinds of updates and the process of doing that update. So first, the couple that we've already seen is updating textures and meshes. So to update textures, you simply make an edit in Substance Painter and then re-export. Those textures get exported and overwritten, and in Unreal Engine, it automatically updates them. It's easy. So that's something that you should already be doing a bunch, but obviously it's one of the important kinds of updates that we do and the most common. Also, we can update meshes. As you've seen throughout my process, if I'm adding a mesh like the chain, then what I'm doing is updating that mesh inside of Maya and re-exporting the FBX. That overwrites the original, and then in Unreal Engine, it gets updated. So you can add or remove materials this way too. If I wanted another texture set, or if I wanted a new special material, I could simply apply a new material in Maya to either a whole new mesh or to even a selection of faces. And then when that comes into Unreal Engine, a new material slot will be available. And then we can just assign whatever material we want. Updating the mesh, also really common, probably gonna do that a lot. Another thing you can update on that model is the UVs. So if you were to update UVs, you'd wanna make those edits to your bake mesh version if you have multiple versions. It's really whatever version you are loading into Substance Painter that you're painting or making the textures on. So you need to make the change to those UVs and then re-export that mesh and import it back into Substance Painter. And you do that by, in Substance Painter, going to the project configuration and loading your new mesh there. This will update the scene and keep everything that had been done except for the painting that had been done in the UV view. So if you've done any painting in the UV view of Substance Painter, that will be lost as you update UVs. It actually stays in place. Something that's good to understand in Substance Painter is the actual painting that you do, the strokes in 3D view are saved and recorded in 3D space. And those same kind of paints and strokes done in the UV view, those are in UV space. So as you move UVs around, you're gonna miss those strokes. But anything that's done in 3D, you can just change out the model and it would still be there as long as there's some mesh there where the strokes were. And then all of the procedurals and everything obviously will just get reapplied. It's one of the great benefits of Substance Painter to be able to do these kind of updates, that it's pretty simple to just switch out the mesh and save like all or most of your texturing work. All right, if the mesh that is loaded into Substance Painter that you made the change on is different than your render mesh that's in your final render scene, then you will need to apply those same UV changes to both meshes. And you can do that in Maya by transferring the UVs from the updated one to the render mesh by using transfer attributes. Okay, next common update is the head. The head updating is simple, and that's by design, because I want it to be very open and fluid to be able to make changes to a head, even like tiny ones. I want no resistance at all. So if you remember, back when we were talking about the base mesh for the head, this is why I use the render mesh as the base mesh in ZBrush so that they're connected. So we can at any time go into ZBrush and change the face, and the high poly and the low poly will still be linked together because we can just update our subdivision level 1, that's our low poly, and then we can update our high poly from the highest subdivision level, and then we can just rebake. The head is unique in that way that the high and the low are connected, and that is to just let us do whatever updates we want. If the updates are very small and detail oriented, then you will need to export both and do a rebake. But if you're just changing like size, proportion, opening the mouth, closing it, doing a pose, you can just update the low poly and you don't have to re-export and rebake. So it depends on what the update is, but either way, the fact that everything is contained in ZBrush makes updating the head pretty straightforward and simple. Okay, so adding meshes. You might also want to add a mesh, maybe a prop, maybe a detail, extra buckle. You can add meshes at any time too. You just have to remember when you do add the mesh, if it has to have new UVs, then it'll have to fit into whatever texture set it's going to be a part of. You'll do that by assigning a material. So if you add a mesh to your character, make sure it has a material assigned. Typically, it'll be assigned a material you already have. And then by selecting all of that, you can find a space in the UV map. Or if you're just duplicating something that you already have, then all you have to do is duplicate it and move it around. Then you just need to export it into the engine if that's what you're doing, and that'll overwrite it. Or if you are adding a brand new mesh with new UVs, then you'll need to re-import that back into Substance Painter so that you can put some textures on there too, and then re-export those textures along with that new updated mesh. Updating the high poly model. You can also update the high poly model if needed. You know, that is something that you're trying to avoid, but if inspiration arises or there's just some sort of need to update the high poly, you can absolutely do that too. If you just change or add details that doesn't modify the silhouette, then you would just need to simply re-export that high poly and then do another bake. That's pretty easy. If you make a larger change to the high poly, then you will need to go back to the low poly model and modify that to fit. So if you change the silhouette or make it very different, then you will need to update the low poly so that it fits. Sometimes you'll then need to update the UVs of that new low poly, especially if you have to like delete faces and make new faces. You can do that, and then you'll have to rebuild it. Then you have to re-UV map it, make sure that it fits. Then you'd export that low poly, bring that back into Substance Painter, and then you would export that new high poly and bring that into Substance Painter and do a rebake. Okay, so rebaking. You definitely want to be comfortable with this because so many different kinds of updates will end up needing to be baked again. So fortunately, this is fairly easy with Substance Painter. You just need to update the low poly and then add the new high poly meshes. So the low poly again is in the project configuration, and the high poly meshes can be seen in the list in the bake settings. This is where having all of your high poly model as a single FBX file can be a downside. Having each high poly model, at least the ones that might change, separated makes this as simple as just choosing the one on the list you want to remove and then adding the new one. But if you do have a single FBX high poly file, then you'll need to re-export the whole thing and bring that into Substance and replace what you had. So with an updated low poly and an updated high poly to match, it's as simple as hitting bake again, and then all the new mesh maps will be generated, and then subsequently all of the modifiers and dynamic things in your texture scene will be updated. So that's how you update everything. The textures, the model, the UVs, the high poly models, and baking. The goal here should be to be comfortable making a change and update anytime you have an idea to make things better. Going through these workflows and making these updates truly is the single most impactful part of the entire process, I would say. Getting to the point where I have my mesh in Unreal or in the render scene, I have my Substance Painter scene, I have my Maya scene, I have my ZBrush scene. That's where I feel at home. That's where I really feel like the art begins and the craft begins. Like I love getting there. And now it's just about like, let's check it out in the scene. Let's move some lights around. Let's think about it. Let's do some renders and then think, oh, you know, how can I make this better? And then do a laundry list of things. And I'm just going through those things. Honestly, like I spend most of my time, like ideally maybe 50% or more is after this point where you have all the source files ready and then you're just jumping between them to do an update. And I don't think of like doing updates based on specific software. I just think of the final product, like there it is in front of you. They're creative decisions, creative ideas, and then you go through the technical to arrive at that again. You're always looking at the final product and then you're iterating on it. Like a 2D artist or a painter would be looking at the painting and thinking, brushstroke. It just so happens that for us to do certain kinds of brushstrokes, we have to hop around to these different softwares, export different files, and blah, blah, blah. So this is what I believe is the key to making the strongest work possible. Iterate, iterate, iterate. All right, that's it for this one. I'll see you in the next video. Thank you for watching. I hope you found that helpful. This is just one of the lessons from my class. There's over 70 now. I take students all the way from choosing a concept through to modeling all the way to delivering the character in Unreal Engine. I genuinely believe that if you are really serious about making 3D characters, the class can help you make the best character you've made yet. So check it out at characterclass.com.